Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's great to see you all today. Thanks for taking time. There are insects in this presentation, so if you're feeling squeamish, be prepared. Again, I'm Valerie Stull. I'm an interdisciplinary environmental health scientist. I work in the Center for Sustainability and the Global Environment and the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology here at UW-Madison, and I was previously with the Global Health Institute. So my work really sits at the nexus of human health, agriculture, and the environment. So today we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is tiny bites for health on eating insects and the quest for sustainable protein. And bear with my nasally voice. I'm a little under the weather, but I wanted to be here, so forgive me if I have to drink some water or blow my nose. It's not COVID, I can promise you that. Just a little cold from my son's daycare. So the first time that I willingly ate an insect, I was probably 13 years old, 12 or 13, on a family trip to Central America. And I say the word willingly with some hesitation because I was pretty squeamish about it when the chef brought out this plate of fried ants for us to try. And I remember like, ew, 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 and like bringing this ant up to my mouth and then putting it in my mouth, and it was crispy and kind of citrusy and tasty. I don't know what I was expecting, but that was my first real experience thinking about insects as food. And they are in fact food for a lot of people around the world. It wasn't until years later that I thought about them again as food when I was embarking on my master's degree research in Zambia, looking at food security interventions. But I was staying in a village in a kind of rural area just outside the capital of Lusaka. And one day, the kids were going crazy. They were running around, they were catching these giant ants, and they were so excited about them, these flying ants called mafulifute. And I'll never forget this, them just piling them into their pockets and running back. And then we cooked them over a flame and added some salt, and we were eating them all afternoon. And they taste like popcorn. They're really good. And they're just a snack. And it was the first time I thought about insects as food in association with joy and positivity, instead of this negative view that we, as most of us maybe who grew up in the United States, view insects. So that started me on the path that I am on now. So I'm teaching a new word. This is entomophagy or entomophagy, which is the practice of eating insects as food. And it is a diverse and nuanced practice. It is, as you can see from these photos, a wide number of insects are eaten by different people across the whole world in different ways. I want to preface my talk by saying everything I'm sharing with you is part of a research project that I direct at UW called MIGHTY, the Mission to Improve Global Health Through Insects. And we are using robust empirical and applied research to investigate the social, environmental, and health implications of eating insects and farming them as a new source of food. So we are currently working in the US, and we have collaborations in Guatemala, Uganda, Zambia, and South Africa, with hopes to expand further from there. So my real interest in insects as food is because food matters, right? Agricultural production is the primary driver of global environmental change. We use 40% of the ice-free land on this planet for agriculture, either for grazing animals, growing food, growing timber, and other things that we use in our daily lives. 30% of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions, or GHGs, come from the food system. We use 70% of all the fresh water that people use is for agriculture. So obviously it's very important for the environment. So if we hone in on a few environmental pressures on the food system and on our planet going forward, we can see that specific food categories have different impacts on the environment. So this is a study by Springman et al. In 2018, and he showed that animal products, here in red, put the most pressure on our greenhouse gas emissions, our cropland use, and our water use. And this isn't super surprising because you've probably heard that beef requires more land and fresh water per ton protein produced than any plant-based protein or any other animal-based protein. It also is responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions. So this isn't to demonize all beef. This is just to say that livestock production is putting a big pressure on the food system. And the authors of this paper estimate that by the year 2050, or between 2010 and 2050, the environmental effects of the food system could increase 50 to 90% in the absence of changes to what we're doing right now, which would be really detrimental to the stability of our planet. So if I had to summarize the current agricultural context in one slide, I know people spend their whole careers thinking about this, I would say that our food system is pressured by a growing population, by climate change, which is expected to have negative overall impacts on our ability to grow food in the next 50 years, by food waste. We waste a third of all the food that we produce. It just goes into landfills and emits methane. And then a shifting demand. So as the population grows in countries all over the world, and you have more people in the middle class, they have more money and more desire to eat those extra delicious but resource-intensive foods like meat and dairy, which are hard on the environment. Not only are we producing more food than ever before, but we're often doing so in ways that I consider to be unsustainable and that actually drive climate change. And we face another challenge and that is inequitable distribution of food. There's more than enough food to feed everyone on the planet today, but we have, 770 million people that are undernourished still. And at the same time, we have a problem with overnutrition and obesity and overweight, which are causing other health complications. So I'm thinking of our current agricultural context as being on the edge. It's on the edge of potentially breaking in a way that would be catastrophic. So clearly there's a need for innovative agricultural solutions that protect both human and planetary health. So the health of us and the health of our planet. And one such solution is the use of insects as food, which they're already being used, but if we want to optimize the use of insects as food and also as feed for our animals. So I first got interested in this from an academic standpoint in 2013 because the United Nations came out with a big report. It was published by the Food and Agriculture Group of the UN and Wageningen University, and they were saying, we should promote insect consumption globally to combat malnutrition. And this report, I think, is 100 pages long, and I read this report, and at the end, I was like, yes, and I have a million questions about it. So there comes a PhD, right? There comes a academic career in a sense. So for us, how many of you have intentionally eaten an insect? All right, we got one. Yes, two. All right, perfect. Well, you've all eaten insects because they're in our food all the time. But it may be strange for us in the US to think about eating insects as food, but actually about 2 billion people in more than 130 countries are in places where insect consumption is happening commonly. And there are more than 2,100 known edible species. And that just means a species that has been documented to have been eaten by a population. So there are probably a lot more edible insects than that just haven't been documented yet. These insects are consumed in a variety of ways. They're eaten raw, they're boiled, they're fried, they're dried and pounded into powders and added to other foods, and they're part of traditional food cuisines all around the world. So insect consumption is happening in almost every country that we have records of. The number of species varies widely, and you'll see that, it can be as little as 1 to 5 species and up to 300 if you look at Mexico, 200 to 300 different species consumed in India and China. And as you can also tell, insect consumption is largely a tropical phenomenon. You see that it's most intense across the tropics in the world, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But one question you may be wondering is, humans have been eating insects throughout history. Why is that? Why have insects been part of cuisine? And ultimately, by the end of this talk, we'll talk about why they're not part of our cuisine so much today. But the reason they've been eaten by humans and our ancestors is that they're widely abundant, right? They're ubiquitous across the whole world. They comprise about 1 of the 1.5 million species described. I really think if the insects got together, they could take over. We would be done if insects were united against us. They're also nutrient dense. Chimpanzees and early humans probably always ate insects because of their high protein and high fat content, and also their relatively easy access, specifically termites. And you can see over here, they're actually fishing for termites using a stick. You just put it into the mound, the termites latch on, you pull it out, you got a nice little termite bite. But why are termites great? They don't run away from you. They're easier. They're not like a game. Every day that termite mound is there. So evolutionarily, it makes sense. And there's anthropological evidence that insects may have contributed to our hominid ancestors' cognitive evolution. So we may actually be able to give some credit to insects for us getting bigger brains, essentially, because of that consistent, high nutrient dense food that they were providing. So if we go back to the scale of insect consumption globally, I do want to point out that we estimate that more than 90% of insects consumed today are harvested from the wild. So they're actually wild foraged. That's great because it's a free, locally available resource to anyone that wants to engage in it. The downsides of wild harvesting are safety. You don't always know what a wild harvested insect has been exposed to or feeding on. There's also ecological concerns. We've seen some examples in sub-Saharan Africa of people cutting down trees, for example, to get to rare insect species. And if you over-harvest one species from an ecosystem, you can, of course, potentially damage other animals in that ecosystem. And also, a lot of insects are seasonally available. So if you're talking about trying to improve human health year-round by eating insects, you need them to be available more than just 3 months of the year, right? So that's why I'm really interested in mini livestock, tiny livestock, insects as a new agricultural activity, a new farming activity that we can engage in to improve safe access to insects year-round. So humans actually have a long history of farming insects. We are really great with silkworms and honeybees. We know a lot about domesticating those insects or taking care of them. We are not so great at the wide variety of other insects. We're just now kind of scratching the surface of domesticating or large-scale farming other insects. So there are many reasons that insect farming is a good idea. First and foremost, insects have a higher feed conversion efficiency than other livestock. This means they're more efficient at converting food into body mass. One reason for this is that they're ectotherms or cold-blooded, right? So they don't actually waste calories or energy regulating their body temperature the way we do. So they're more efficient at actually taking food and moving it into body mass. Another thing to think about is that, because they're more efficient at converting food into body mass, they overall require significantly less feed. And that feed can actually come from waste streams. Some species of insects are really great recyclers. They can convert things like cow manure or food waste or any other organic material into a nutritious food source for chickens or fish, or even for us, depending on how we process them. And there's new research showing that some species of insects can break down styrofoam. So dealing with waste streams that we have a huge problem with right now. So people are just starting to really research insects to deal with waste. Another example would be grain that gets infected with aflatoxin or some type of mycotoxin. Some insects can actually eat that and remediate it, and otherwise it's just a wasted product. Or spent grain from a brewery. Some insects can use that, because brewers are like, what do I do with this grain that's left over after I make beer? They're just throwing it away, but we could be potentially feeding it to insects. And then lastly, in terms of feed, you should think about the whole picture. Chickens and fish are also really efficient at converting food into body mass, but you can't eat a whole chicken. Like, you take off the feathers, you're not just putting the whole chicken in your mouth, but you can actually eat a whole cricket. And the majority of that is going to be bioavailable to you. And some of the rest of that might be fiber, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Insects also require significantly less water to produce than conventional livestock. They're really efficient at drawing water out of their feed. So to produce 1 gram of protein from mealworm takes at least 4 times less water. And I've seen estimates that are even more extreme, making insects look really good, but I don't trust all of those data. So I'm showing you this one. But that's a really good sign when you think about climate change causing more extreme weather events in the future. So we need our food system to be resilient to perturbations in water availability. And then I mentioned that the insects require less feed. Well, they also require less land, and not just because they're small, but because we need less land to grow the feed to feed them. So as you can see, the UN estimates a cow beef protein might require 143 to 260 meters squared, whereas a mealworm is only 20. And to that same end, some insects are social species and they actually like tight confined spaces. You can rear them vertically. This is actually an insect farm with these trays just vertically. You don't need access to land to be an insect farmer. I was farming mealworms under my kitchen sink here in Madison in my 1-bedroom apartment when I didn't have a yard. So it actually really increases the potential for small-scale insect farming to improve people's access to food outside of a conventional food system, something they could do in their own house, which is exciting to me when you think about poverty and high rates of food insecurity. In addition to their highly efficient use of natural resources, edible insects are also responsible for significantly fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So mealworms, crickets, and locusts, as you can see here, produce or emit significantly fewer greenhouse gases than cattle or pigs. Of course, some insects do emit greenhouse gases. Termites, for example, are actually farming a fungus, and they're composting things inside their mounds, so they do emit methane. But most of the insects that we're really interested in farming, like crickets and mealworms, are really low emitters of greenhouse gases, compared to cattle who, through enteric fermentation, are emitting a lot of methane. And then I always say that edible insects really pack a punch when it comes to nutrition. They're really high in protein with all the essential amino acids for human nutrition. They're also high in healthy fatty acids and micronutrients. So here you can see the domestic house cricket actually outperforms beef in terms of calcium, iron, and zinc composition, which is interesting. If you have allergies, you may be interested to know that insect protein, depending on what the insect was reared on, can be dairy, gluten, soy, and nut-free, which is interesting. So some people that are really interested in like allergens and proteins might be interested in insect protein. There's also new research looking at bioactive peptides and antioxidants in insects that may have health benefits to people that consume them, which are probably mostly linked to, at least the antioxidants, to the feed source of the insect, which is interesting. So insects are perhaps best known for their protein content. And I heard someone mention like 75% protein or something in the back before the talk started. And yes, if you look at insects on a dry weight basis, they're really, really high in protein, like 50 to 75% protein. But that's a little misleading because usually they're comparing that to beef, which is a fresh weight product, not a dried product. So if we compare them all on a fresh weight, they're still like very comparable to other protein sources like beef, chicken, and eggs, as you can see here in the blue. This farmed house cricket has a little bit less fat, but the interesting thing is that it has more polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, those good heart healthy ones like omega-3s. So that's great. And then most exciting to me is that unlike any other animal product, edible insects have fiber. Isn't that interesting? An animal product with dietary fiber. So we know that diets high in dietary fiber are associated with reduced risks of some cancers, diverticular disease, coronary heart disease. So a high fiber diet is great. And if you're getting fiber plus a good protein source plus iron and zinc, I mean, that's a win-win in my book. And we'll talk more about the fiber in a minute. But this is all to say that I'm really excited about insects for multiple reasons, and that's because they have many potential uses. Of course, humans can consume them directly, as I mentioned. We can also feed them to fish and chickens. We know that the aquaculture industry, one of the biggest parts that makes it less sustainable is the actual feed for the fish. And where is that feed coming from if you're farming fish? So what if we use insects for part of the feed for fish? That could actually help reduce the environmental impact. There's a couple products on the market now that have crickets in dog treats. So if you want to reduce the impact of your animals, of your pets' food, you can actually feed them insects. And dogs do not discriminate, I can tell you. They eat those just fine. And then, as I mentioned, we can use insects to reduce waste. There's some efforts to think about that in Wisconsin with dairy farming, because there's a big problem with manure and how do you manage dairy cow manure. And then, as I mentioned, potential to use it to break down plastics. The insect waste itself, which is called frass, is actually a great fertilizer. So why not just put that right back in your garden if you're farming insects? And then we can separate insects into their component parts, their protein, their fat, their fiber, and actually use that in a variety of different ways, including the RUTF, ready-to-use therapeutic food market, which is creating those specialty products to distribute in cases of famine and acute malnutrition. So right now we usually use soy or whey in those products, but what if we could locally produce insect protein to then, help the whole region in the case of famine or something? And then this is something where I'm looking at right now, which is like using insects in a circular economy. So what if you're a farmer, you have some cows, you have some chickens, you then give the extra manure that you're not putting on your fields to black soldier fly insects. They create this nutrition packed snack that you feed to your chickens, and it's like all happening on one farm. It's like a closed loop waste reduction system. I'm excited about these circular models. So that should implies that everything is grand and insects are the solution, but it's not all easy, right? These things are not easy. So it's not daisies and roses. There are lots of things we need to think about. It's a really nascent industry. We need to consider how we should treat insects. They are also living creatures, like worthy of our respect. So how should we treat them ethically? How do we optimize production and balance that with profits for new insect farmers that may be emerging, and not just go the way of a capitalistic conventional agriculture that's kind of driven by profits alone? How do we mitigate risks? There are, of course, risks of disease or escape of insects if you're farming them in mass quantities. How do we adhere to and push against cultural and social traditions where appropriate? So like, I think it's good to push Americans to think differently about insects as food, get them to try insects, which again, I'm sorry I didn't bring snacks, I wanted to. And also whose voices are at the table. So like, there are a bunch of new researchers in the US and Europe that are really excited about insects, but actually people in Thailand have been farming them and using them as food for generations. So they actually know a lot more than we do, and their voices should be at in these conversations. So this is all to say that insect agriculture and entomophagy have the potential, I think, to improve health with a lower environmental impact than some other protein sources. But there's a big research gap. We need to understand how to cultivate them, what the direct health impacts are of eating them, how feasible it is, where and how to make them socially acceptable, and how they should be regulated. These are actually all things that I've been working on at UW-Madison. So I thought for today, it might be interesting to just give you a little research snapshot of a few things I've been thinking about in the last 8 years, 10 years. Okay, so one of my big takeaways from my work is that perceptions of insects as food matter no matter where you are. Whether you're in a place where insects are already consumed or not, people's perceptions of them really vary. So travel with me back to Zambia as we started the talk. I've done a lot of work there. I did a Fulbright scholarship award there, and Zambia is a country that faces pervasive food insecurity, malnutrition, and poverty. We have very high rates of stunting among children less than 5, meaning low height for age. So a lot of children are undernourished. The practice of eating insects is common throughout the country, not everywhere. But the vast majority of the insects consumed are harvested from the wild, and they're only seasonally available. So people are not typically eating insects with every meal all year round. To my knowledge, insect farming is nearly non-existent in the country. I know of a few tiny projects, but none of them have taken off. But it's a very vast rural agrarian country with a lot of environmental resources. I think 86% of smallholders in Zambia are farming corn or maize in addition to something else. And there's a lot of crop residue that could potentially be utilized to feed insects, for example. There's just a lot of environmental resources that we could tap into. So in the case of Zambia, the benefits of mini livestock or farming insects cannot be realized if people don't want to eat them. And that's something that when I first arrived, I had this Western American hat, and I was like, well, you eat insects, so why wouldn't you want to eat farmed insects? That's such a naive American perspective, right? And I had to learn really quickly that some insects have really important traditional and spiritual value. And the idea of farming them outside of their natural habitat, it wouldn't be very acceptable to people. I also had to learn very quickly that not all insects are food, and not all insects that some people are food to other people. So it's not a category, which I'll mention again. But the benefits also can't be realized if access is insufficient to make a valuable contribution to the diet. And I think that's what's happening now in some parts of Zambia. You have people eating several species of insects for a week or two, or maybe a month during the year. And so it's not actually helping nutrition status of kids year round. People aren't gonna experience benefits from farming insects if producing or collecting them is really labor intensive or really expensive, obviously. So I wanted to know, how do people in Zambia think about edible insects now, and what information do we need as we consider farming them in the future? So I spent 12 months doing kind of a qualitative ethnography and spending a lot of time with one particular village. And my work there suggests that how people view insect eating today will, in fact, impact future adoption or rejection of insect farming. And that people think about edible insects socially, which is kind of how we think about all food, right? There's food that we eat. There's peanut butter and jelly sandwich that you just eat for lunch on a random day. And then there's turkey and mashed potatoes, which are really valuable, and we eat them on Thanksgiving, and we have this association that comes with family. And so food is not just food, it's like wrapped up in our social values and belief systems, right? So I mentioned that I had this Western hat and this American bias when I came in, and I learned that all of these things that we kind of think about insects are wrong. Something that people say to me a lot is like, well, aren't people just eating insects because there's nothing else to eat? It's like a last resort food. Oh, I just told you the story of the kids that were out of their minds excited about these insects as a delicacy that come out once a year. People do not just eat insects out of desperation. That is false. I also assumed that insect was a category of food. Like, you eat meat, you eat edible insects, you eat vegetables. It's not a category of food, and that's not how people think about it. People really think of certain species as food and other species just as insects, even if other people in the country are eating that other species of insect. So you can't make assumptions that, people will want to eat every insect just because they eat termites, for example. In fact, we couldn't even decide on what an insect as food category was, because people kept thinking of small food. So they would talk about lizards and mice and other small foods that people eat in rural areas. And like, we could never get to like, what is insect as like, is it taxonomy? Like, what does that even mean? It was fascinating. And also I did find, though, that there is variability in how valuable edible insects are, even if they're acceptable. Some are just more valuable than others. And that aligned really closely with social perceptions and social values. So insects that were less associated with labor and more associated with abundance and money were more valuable than insects that were associated with labor. So for an example, termites. The flying alights come out once or twice a year, very easy to harvest. You put up a light, the insects swarm, they fall into a bucket of water, and you're eating them for days, maybe weeks. Cicadas, you have to catch them one by one out of a tree. And so the little boys run around with sticks with sap on the end and like catch cicadas out of the trees. But no mother who's got a million other things to do is going to go chasing cicadas, right? So even though it's totally fine to be eating cicadas, they're not as valuable as termites in society, which I thought was really interesting. I also learned interesting things about, myths about insects and sexuality and gender. And it's so much more complicated than you would think. So the takeaway from that time is that an edible insect is not an insect is not an insect. So we simply cannot assume that any farmable species will be accepted. We can't just throw in a haphazard farming system. So, for example, in the US, there are several big cricket farms that are farming crickets for human consumption. Just because a community eats grasshoppers does not mean they will eat this species of cricket that you know how to farm. So, we need to collaborate. We need to select appropriate species and carefully design our projects and raise awareness of the benefits. I also found that there was really a lot of variability in what people thought about insects in terms of their food value. So, like today, I was just showing you the protein, the fat, the micronutrients. There was very little understanding of why insects might be valuable. So education there could be valuable too here as well. And then, of course, if we're thinking about the US or the European concept, we have to overcome this ick factor perception that we have, that insects are icky. But I think that also for us varies across species. We in the industry call crickets the gateway bug, because crickets, but you're not as grossed out by a cricket as you are a maggot or a mosquito. But you don't like a cricket the way you do a butterfly or a ladybug, right? Crickets are kind of neutral. Like, we hear them, we associate them with nighttime or summer, but we don't hate them. So they're like the gateway bug. They're probably the easiest bug that you can get an American to eat. And I think there's good evidence to show that that is true. So anyway, to sum up, if you want to read more on my Zambian work, it's been published in Agriculture and Human Values, and it was definitely the most fun study I've done learning about culture and tradition and food. So, okay, we'll move on to takeaway number 2. There are clear nutritional gains and other potential health benefits from eating insects, but we need a lot more data. There's a lot of publications out there that have quantified the nutrient composition of different insect species. This much protein, this much vitamin B12, but very little, if any, data research on population level impacts of eating insects or direct health impacts of consuming it. I attribute this to a long-standing bias in Western science against insects as food. We simply didn't find the time of day to care about them in the past. But now we do, and so there's some growing research, including mine. So one real question that I've had all along is, we can think about individuals, but what if we think about populations? What if insects were actually part of the daily diet, just a small amount, kind of every day, in these areas, particularly where food insecurity is a big problem? So I wanted to do this as a modeling study where we use available data and project out what would happen if a bunch of people ate insects. So I collaborated with some folks at Harvard that are experts in modeling, and we did just that. So our research question was kind of, what is the impact of modest daily consumption on health in regions that already have a high prevalence of nutrient deficiencies? So we looked at really small amounts of insect consumption, 2.5, 5, and 10 grams per day. That's such a little amount to eat of something. But we did it by dry weight. And then we looked at the impact of that amount of insect on the total nutritional intake of a population and measured how it affects the risk for deficiency of certain nutrients of concern. So we're talking about nutrients that have real public health implications in terms of growth and development, and nutrients that insects are good sources of: protein, zinc, folate, vitamin B12, and iron. And we used what's called this global expanded nutrient supply data set, which basically gives us an average of the nutrients available to every person within a country at one time. Oh, iron. Iron is very hard to, there's a lot of confounders for iron. So we did look at iron, but it was difficult to make find big results because there are confounders in terms of iron absorption from the diet. Yeah, sorry, should have explained that. So we parsed out our study according to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal grouping, or regional groupings. And we did this because we needed bounds. We needed some type of bounds for the study. And using these groupings was good because they've been categorized according to, similarities in culture and climate across these regions. We focus specifically on regions where nutritional deficiencies are prevalent and regions where insect consumption is already common. So people are already eating insects. We looked at Sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa and Western Asia, Central and South Asia, East and Southeast Asia. And the countries in gray, we didn't have enough data, so they were eliminated from the data set, unfortunately. So what we did for each of these regions is we made basically big averages that considered 4 to 8 regionally appropriate insect species that are also farmable. So the idea is there's no way everyone in South Africa could eat 5 grams of insect a day unless they're being farmed. There's no way that you could just wild harvest enough to feed that many people. And I think farming is beneficial on a number of other levels. But essentially, we made this big database and selected specific insects for each region and took averages of the nutritional content of those insects and put them into our model. So jumping straight to results, what we found is that there are significant benefits from just 5 grams per day of insect consumption across most of Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. It was variable across the regions in terms of impact, but most significant impacts we saw were in Sub-Saharan Africa and less so in North Africa and West Asia. And the reason for this, we think, is actually that baseline risk of nutritional deficiency was different across these regions. Additionally, we had to factor in current dietary trends and the nutrient composition of the specific species for each region. So in places where undernutrition and nutritional risk of deficiency is already higher, there was more potential for insects at a small amount to make an impact. So if we give you an example, Madagascar, our friendly island nation to the southeast of the African continent, could be helped significantly by adding insects to the daily diet. The population there is about 24 million, and most people get the vast majority of their calories from starchy roots like cassava and other cereals, so not super high in protein. The baseline rates of deficiency risk are among the highest in the world, so Madagascar has a really high rates of undernutrition. But just 5 grams of insect per day per person could lower the risk of protein deficiency by 3.2%, bringing 910,000 people out of protein deficiency. 5.5% lower for zinc deficiency, bringing 1.5 million people out of risk for zinc deficiency. And folate deficiency, about 6.8% or 1.9 million people. So these percentages are small, but if you look at the number of people that could actually be out of the risk of these deficiencies, that's substantial from a public health standpoint. And B12 was 1.3 million people, or 4.8% as well. So, and I will just say, this is really exciting to me because I've been working with a professor at California. He's with the California Technology and Society group and Cal Poly, I think. But they have set up a cricket farming project in Madagascar using an endemic cricket species that is already consumed there. And their initial goal was actually to help reduce the use of bushmeat, of lemurs as food. So diverting people from eating lemurs for protein to insects for protein. And they've actually successfully set up a huge farm, and they're starting to put crickets in school lunches in Madagascar to help combat child undernutrition. So really exciting project there. So the global impact of supplementing diets with edible insects in the regions that we included, just the regions we included, at 5 grams a day could yield 67 million fewer people at risk of protein deficiency, 166 million fewer people at risk of zinc deficiency, 237 for folate deficiency. And I think that what this does more than anything is confirms the viewpoint that insect agriculture and eating insects is worth exploring from a global health perspective alone, not even taking into account all the environmental benefits of insects. We should be looking at them as a nutrient resource for these populations. So, and I also just wanted to mention that it's not just academics that are looking at this. PATH, which is a Seattle-based global health organization that works all over the world, gets a lot of funding from Gates Foundation. They have been working with palm weevil larvae, which is a delicacy in Ghana and also Central Africa, and trying to figure out how to put it into a ground like peanut butter, adding palm weevil larvae for a complementary food for children. So a food that you feed to kids when they're getting off breast milk and they're moving and they're getting older in those critical times where nutrition is super important. And so that's, I mean, this is just really exciting that you have Gates funding going into this work to actually improve health for kids. Okay, last study that I just want to mention briefly. I was also really interested in the impact of eating insects on our gut microbiota because of that unique fiber that is in edible insects. So I wanted to answer this question broadly. Are there health benefits of cricket consumption? I picked crickets because that's what's available here in North America, beyond nutrition for a healthy US population. So I say beyond nutrition because some people do not consider fiber a nutrient because it is not digested by you. It is fermented by the bacteria in your gut. So we're thinking about what's happening with the fiber in insects and how might it impact our health. So we did what's called a randomized double-blind crossover trial where each person was their own control. And we gave people 25 grams per day of whole cricket powder for 14 days. And then they did a washout period, and then they had a control diet without cricket powder. We picked 25 grams to kind of mimic what's in a protein shake. If you wanted to take a high dose of another protein, soy or whey, it would probably be 20 to 30 grams if you bought one of those shakes. So we're kind of like, what would crickets look like if we did that instead? So I think the justification for this study is pretty clear. We know that insects are nutrient dense, and compared to other animal foods, they are high in fiber. Chitin is the primary component of the insect exoskeleton, also its respiratory linings, digestive and excretory systems. And we wanted to think we wanted to discover if chitin or other insect fibers could be prebiotic. So by prebiotic, I mean non-digestible food items that promote the growth of beneficial gut bacteria, and those are probiotics. So you all know probiotics from your yogurt and everything, but how do you keep those alive? You have to feed them, and you feed them with prebiotics. So not to get into chemistry here, but you should know that chitin is considered an insoluble fiber, but through the process of deacetylation, which could happen in digestion in our gut, it can convert to more soluble forms, including chitosan and chitin oligosaccharides. And we know that oligosaccharides from other food sources are prebiotics. So we weren't crazy in thinking it's possible that chitin serves as a prebiotic. This was kind of the justification for it. And then why do we care about the microbiome? Why do we care about the microbes in our gut? Well, we probably have about 3 times more bacterial cells in our gut and our body than we do human cells. So we are more bacteria than human, maybe. They also encode about 100 times more genes than our cells. We know that the microbiota in our gut respond to our diet, respond to nutritional cues in our diet, and they go on to generate these signals in our body that influence everything from our metabolism and our immune system to our nutritional status and to how we go through diseases and even our well-being. There's actually a lot of data now on the gut microbiome and mental health, which is crazy and really interesting. So that's why we care about it. Also, there were no comprehensive clinical studies on the tolerability or impact of eating insects on the microbiota. So no one had done anything like this before us. And so we were kind of just seeing what would happen, seeing what might happen in this kind of pilot study. So we partnered with Colorado State University and we ran this crossover trial where everyone was their own control. We recruited from the university campus and the Fort Collins, Colorado area, and we managed to get 20 gullible volunteers to join our study. We excluded anyone with food allergies. If you have questions later, insects do have allergens, so some people might be allergic to them. We excluded anyone taking antibiotics because we care about what's going on in the gut. Anyone with like major health issues or on medications that would interfere with our study, and anyone who is pregnant or lactating just for safety. And basically our treatment was that 100% cricket powder at 25 grams per day. We used a commercially available food grade cricket powder that you can buy online from a company called Entimo Farms in Canada. It's a Canadian company. And we had this powder analyzed and we found that it was about 8.5% fiber and about a little over 7 grams of that per every 100 gram is insoluble. So we think that insoluble fiber is chitin, which is what we're mostly interested in. So our study design, basically we randomized those 20 participants into one of 2 cohorts. And the first cohort, they got the control breakfast for 14 days, and then they went through a 14-day washout, which means you just went back to your regular diet. And then they went to the treatment, which was the cricket breakfast for 14 days. And the other group did the opposite because we didn't want them to know which one they were taking. And we didn't want to know which one they were taking either. But I will say it's very hard to disguise 25 grams of cricket in anything. It was tricky. So we took at baseline and after each treatment, we took blood samples to look at toxicity and tolerability. We took a stool sample to look at changes in the microbiome, and we had them fill out a questionnaire to tell us if they were having any weird side effects from eating cricket, because it is a novel fiber source and a pretty novel protein source in the average American diet. So I'm jumping straight to results here. All 20 of our participants finished the study. What? That never happened. We lucked out with that because essentially we were giving people crickets. They were giving us their poop. It was like a fair exchange. We had a very young, healthy population. I mean, the average age was 26. We had 11 women and 9 men with pretty healthy BMIs and blood glucose levels. So it's not representative of the US population. We know that. Okay, these were self-enlisted volunteers who saw our flyers and were like, I'd like to eat crickets for 2 weeks. So we know that. We recognize this was not representative of the US, but it was a pilot study. So we found via our GI questionnaire that the participants did not report any significant GI effects. So we didn't have anyone complaining about eating this much cricket, which is good. From our comprehensive metabolic panel, which included, it's a measure of toxicity. So it included things like glucose, sodium, potassium, and a bunch of enzymes. We didn't see any indications of toxicity. Thank goodness. People have been eating insects forever, so I'd be very surprised if they had toxicity, particularly insects that were farmed for consumption. But that's good. The only significant thing we saw in the comprehensive metabolic panel was a slight increase in a liver enzyme called alkaline phosphatase, or ALP. And this liver enzyme is associated, low levels of it are associated with malabsorption in the gut or malnutrition. So an increase could be indicative of improved kind of gut homeostasis. I should clarify that all of our participants were still within a normal range for ALP. So ALP has a really wide range of what is normal. But what we did see is a significant reduction in ALP across all participants. So that's suggestive of improved gut health, basically. We also looked at circulating cytokines in plasma, which are those kind of cell signaling proteins. And we only found one significant change, which was lower levels of tumor necrosis factor alpha, or TNF alpha, with cricket consumption. So TNF alpha is considered a pro-inflammatory cytokine, meaning that you will see higher levels of TNF alpha with inflammation, with systemic inflammation. So reduced TNF alpha is a positive outcome, which suggests improvements in gut barrier function. So the ability of your gut villi and your gut to protect you against pathogens and disease. So if you put the increase in alkaline phosphatase and the TNF alpha together, it starts to tell a little story about potentially benefits to gut homeostasis or to gut health. But when our study came out, a few news people wanted to say, crickets are the best thing for your gut since something else. And no, I cannot say that. This was a pilot study, a small study. We need more research, but this is suggestive of a benefit that we should explore further. If we look at the microbiota composition on a phyla level, we didn't see any major changes after eating the cricket, and that's good. If we did, I'd be shocked because it was a short study. It was only 14 days. And if your microbiota changes that fast, it's a sign of like major dysbiosis or bad things are happening in your gut. So that was another good sign. What we did see was a significant change in the relative abundance of several different taxa of microbiota in the gut. And the biggest change, we don't know a lot about all of these different taxa. We just don't know what they're doing. I mean, the research on this is changing every day in our understanding. But the biggest change that we saw was down here, which is an increase in the Bifidobacterium animalis, which is a probiotic. So we were kind of excited about this because this was the largest change with eating crickets. It was a 5.7-fold increase in this bacteria compared to the control. And Bifidobacterium animalis happens to be one of the best studied probiotics. We see it in the guts of babies that are breastfed. It's really good for immunity. It's known for inhibiting pathogens in our gut. And there's a commercial strain called BB12, which in several clinical trials has been shown to improve your gastrointestinal function, protect against diarrhea, reduce side effects from antibiotics, and increase resistance to respiratory functions, which is why people add it to yogurt. Or if you buy a probiotic, often it will have a bifidobacterium in it because of these benefits. So it was exciting to see this increase with cricket consumption. We're not super surprised because in industry and in laboratory studies, we've seen that chitin oligosaccharides, that more soluble form of chitin, is bifidogenic, meaning that it can increase the growth of bifidobacterium. But this is, to our knowledge, the first time that a whole food containing chitin has been shown to do this. So that's interesting as well. So if we had to have some takeaways from this study, it was the first study of its kind that showed that cricket consumption was safe at our study dose and exhibited some prebiotic effects, promoting the growth of beneficial gut bacteria. It also is suggestive that there could be other benefits to gut health and reduced inflammation from eating crickets. But my takeaway more than anything is that This warrants more research. You have potentially billions of people eating insects. What are they doing to people's guts? We have now some information, but on one type of insect at one study dose in a healthy population. So we need more research on this topic. Yeah, it was a small pilot study. And we also need to look at risks and benefits of insect consumption. I do want to say that since our study was published, and I think it was published in 2018 or 2019, several studies have demonstrated prebiotic effects from insects and insect chitin and their derivatives in animal models and in laboratory studies. So no other studies in human, but our theory has been confirmed in some other types of studies. And we are actually currently recruiting for participants in a follow-on study. So we are looking at people with IBS who have inflammation of the gut kind of chronically. And instead of giving them whole crickets, we're giving them isolated chitin, isolated cricket fiber at 4 grams per day for 30 days. So we're increasing the inflammation of the person, increasing the dose and the duration, because we want to figure out that mechanism of what's actually happening in the gut. So that's unfortunately happening in Colorado State. Otherwise, I would ask you to volunteer. But it's definitely an easier study because you don't have to eat whole crickets. You're getting like a flavorless fiber instead. But this study was published in Scientific Reports if you want to read more about it. Okay, and then as we are getting short on time, as I knew we would be, I didn't have time to talk about all my research on this topic, but I just want to mention it. I have learned that optimizing environmental benefits and nutritional gains of insects at the same time is harder than it looks. It's harder than it looks on paper because farming insects is tricky. Just like farming any other animal can be tricky. You have potential viruses that come in and kill your whole colony of cricket. You have, other challenges. But for me, I am super passionate about using waste streams or non-food items to feed crickets, because it doesn't make sense to me to divert human food to feed insects or crickets in places where food insecurity is already a problem, right? So I've been looking at using crop residues like corn stover, which is everything left over when you harvest the grain, to feed insects. I've been growing mushrooms on crop residue, and then you have mushrooms and a substrate that you could feed insects. And there's other people looking at this too, but the environmental benefits of insects and their nutritional quality change depending on what you're feeding them, right? So we need more entomology research on the insect biology itself, in addition to the health research side. Okay, so you're probably saying that was really interesting, but it has nothing to do with me because I'm not going to eat insects. Well, I just want to point out that there certainly is an aversion to eating insects in the US, and I think it comes from a few places. These 4 concepts come from a scholar named Julie Lesnick, who's an anthropologist at Wayne State University, and she's phenomenal. We know that the first Europeans to North America and other parts of the world looked at what local people were eating, and if it wasn't pretty similar to what they were already eating, they demonized it. They said, that's disgusting, that's primitive. And that is ethnocentric. That's this idea that our way of doing something is better. And it's a way of othering people who are different than you. So I think there are little snippets of racism and ethnocentrism that come with our antagonism towards insects as food. I also think that we've really embraced this cultural taboo in the US about eating insects, and we think about them really as pests that transmit disease for good reason, because some insects certainly do transmit disease, but most really don't. And we've had, these old shows like Fear Factor. They're putting people in tanks of mealworms and like really leaning into the disgust and the fear around insects. It's hard to overcome that. If you grew up in this culture, it's hard to overcome that. And I recognize that. We've also lived lives that are largely separate from insects. In Wisconsin, there's a good reason for that. It's cold in the winter. We need doors that seal and windows that close. If you grew up in the tropics, and when I was living in Southern Africa, we didn't have screens on our windows. Some people do, of course, but like we were just more in touch with the natural world, and it was, warmer most of the time. That's just a little theory that we just live more separate lives from nature in some ways. And we're very ecophobic. I mean, think about when you find an insect in your house, you're like, kill it, get rid of it, even though you built your house on their house in a way. And Julie Lesnick writes a lot about, just the history, the evolution of humans. So our ancestors migrating from southern to northern latitudes. And it just simply isn't possible to eat insects in the dead of February in Scandinavia. That's not a viable option. So people were putting their energy into finding food in other ways, right? So there's just not a longstanding tradition from northern latitudes of eating insects year round. So that all makes sense. But I don't think we can't overcome these aversions. Food culture does change. 30 years ago, no one in this country was really eating sushi, right? It was disgusting. Like, who wants raw fish? But then it came in New York and it came in San Francisco. And now you can get sushi at a gas station in Nebraska. Don't eat it there. But it's there, right? Like, and I'm not saying that sushi is now on the plates of all Americans, but it's certainly more accepted than it used to be. The same is true for soy products, soy milk, tofu, not readily accepted. But with some strategic health marketing, whether you agree with it or not, you can get a soy latte in every cafe in Madison, right? So I do think that food culture changes. It changes slowly, but it does. And it starts with kids. When I give talks at big events, I usually bring snacks, sorry again. The kids will want to try everything. And it's the parents who are like, don't eat that, it has bugs in it. So like kids are more open-minded. So if we can get the kids on board with eating insects, who knows? I would say that chefs today are really dealing with this new terrain of insect cuisine, and some are being insect forward. They're really putting the insect on display, and other people are using it and hiding it, putting it into a pancake, putting cricket powder into a pancake instead of giving you a whole cricket, because like, we're not actually very good at facing the food that we eat. Like, we like a burger patty, we don't like a cow carcass, right? And so I think the same is probably true for insects. We want a powdered product, not a whole insect. That is how, I got my mom to eat insects and making muffins and things. So it worked. The Seattle Mariners have been selling chapulines, which is this Mexican spiced grasshopper, at their baseball games and selling out like every game because they're delicious and they're hot and they're spicy. So I think the tide is changing. There's more than 30 North American companies making insect-based food products now. You've probably seen some of them. Chapul was on that show Shark Tank. Have you ever seen that show? Then they got funding for a cricket bar. They've moved now to insects for feed, but there's a wide variety. Jim and Eats is an Iowa company, and Harmony Cricket Farm is in Minnesota. So regionally appropriate too. I do think the place where insects are going to make the biggest impact in the Western food system, or in the US, is in the feed space, because we have a very inefficient feed strategy for chickens and fish right now and other animals. And there's a lot of interest in using insects to break down waste to then feed to these animals that we then enjoy. And there's been a lot of investment in insects as feed recently. To that end, there's a brand new BSF, or Black Soldier Fly, working group at UW-Madison, which I am a part of. And we are trying to develop an on-campus colony of black soldier flies to deal with food waste. And our idea is actually to use waste streams generated by the university first, so from the dorms and from the union, and feed it to black soldier flies instead of it going into landfills. A lot of it is composted, but instead of going to landfills. And then we're going to do a bunch of research on that, about the energy efficiency, the nutritional, then we'll feed it to chickens and look at the nutritional quality of the eggs that the laying hens produce and other benefits. There's a researcher that's really interested in, potentially getting probiotics into the insects. So then maybe you have a probiotic and a prebiotic at the same time, and you don't need as many antibiotics for your chickens, right? If you feed them black soldier flies. So we're writing grants right now to get this colony set up on campus. I'm really excited about it because so many potential benefits and questions that we have. So I'll just end by saying, do we all have to eat insects to make a difference in this space? I don't think so, but I don't think we should yuck someone else's yum. Insects are an important part of the food around the world. And like it or not, the US plays an outsized role in the global food trade. So if we can just change how we talk about insects as food, that would make a difference. Heather Loy and her colleagues wrote, to embrace the idea of entomophagy is to embrace in our bodies, as well as our minds and souls, the full humanity of other classes, races, and cultures. And I really like that because it's about respecting other people's food traditions. Take-home messages. There are six legs of this grasshopper. Insects are a legitimate food that can be reared on with a lower environmental impact compared to other animal foods. They require very little land, are low tech, and can be farmed in resource limited areas. There are more than 2,100 species to consider for food and feed. We could use them to recycle wastes, potentially even plastics. They provide ample nutrients and dietary fiber that could boost health. And I don't think insects are the silver bullet to save the world, unfortunately, but it's a really nascent industry and we're just scratching the surface of what is possible. There are also insects with medicinal properties that we haven't fully explored yet. So you've likely seen articles like this. Insects are the future of food. Are insects the future of food and animal feed? Insects, the future of food. The food of the future is bugs. Food of the future. Why the future of food? Yada, yada, yada. But I would argue, actually, insects are the food of the past, the present, and the future. And with that, I thank you for your attention. Sure.
What do wild crickets eat, and is there a commercial food available, like you're in a cricket channel or something?
Yeah, so depending on the species, wild crickets can be omnivores that are eating decaying roots and plant matter and other animals and dead. There's a lot of things depending on the species, and there are commercial cricket feeds available. There are actually a lot of people rearing crickets for reptile feed. So zoos, people who have lizards, they buy live crickets from insectaries around the country that are rearing them. And just in the last, 10, 20 years, people have been adapting those to farm for human food. But there's a commercial cricket feed that you can buy. Yeah, you get them at a bait shop too. Exactly. Yeah, good question. Yes. Thank you.
You said you're writing grants. Who's funding this kind of?
Good question. The question was, who is funding this type of research? So there has been a wide variety of funders in this space. We've been writing grants to the Wisconsin Alumni Foundation. We've written grants to the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research. So some foundations are funding it. Gates has funded some work in this space. There is investment now from some large players. Pepsi, Mars, Tyson are now all interested on the feed side. And so they're putting up money and kind of collaborating with institutions on funding. And then some kind of basic science funders have also put money into this space. Anyone in the food sustainability realm, I've pitched it to so many people, but Rockefeller, players like that have been interested. Good question.
Any federal agency?
Oh, yes. It's a great question. There was a senator from Arizona who's no longer in the Senate who decided that potentially being lobbied by someone in the meat industry to bring to the Agriculture Appropriations Committee a bill that would say the government would not fund insect agricultural research, which was hilarious because we're so small that we were kind of like, wow, somebody's threatened by insect ag, but the bill did not pass the Appropriations Committee. So there has been limited USDA funding, but there has been some. There have been several SBIR grants, the Small Business, is it Innovation Research or something, going into this space. And now there's NSF funding for a big consortium of universities that are partnering with industry. That just started last year. So yeah, so if that comes down, and most of that is for feed, but I think some of it will trickle into the food space as well. Good question. Yes.
As the cricket farms, how much of the output is turn to powder immediately and how much goes to other, like more like whole products? And also if you have like, I'm just trying to imagine, you got 1 million crickets, how do you harvest them?
Oh, good question. The question was about the large scale cricket farms and what % of their product goes into like a powdered product versus a whole cricket, and how do they harvest? I think the majority of the cricket farms in North America are producing powders. The powders are more desirable to consumers. They do make kind of snack packs with whole crickets, but unfortunately, the dried cricket product is kind of crumbly, so it makes more sense to use it as a powder. As for harvesting, I know that there's been a lot of work in this space in terms of trying to automate some of the farming activities, watering, harvesting, moving the crickets around. And I'm not sure how some of the big players are doing that right now. I mean, one way to do it is if they have a lot of, sometimes you use egg crates inside the bins because crickets like to hide and they like having dark little crevices, and then you just pick them up and shake them out into wherever you want them to be. So kind of just moving and shaking is one way to harvest, but I'm not 100% sure about the automating of that process and if people have been successful. The IP, people are, they keep their IP close to their chest with the new robotics around insect ag. Good question. Yes.
A little different. How does cricket powder taste?
Good question. How does cricket powder taste was the question. Cricket, I would say, are kind of nutty and earthy tasting. You wouldn't want to like eat a spoonful of cricket powder. It wouldn't be very good. But using it in a baked good, it can really just kind of fall into the background or add a little bit of a nutty background flavor. I like to explain also that the sad thing is that here in the US, what we have available to us is dried insects exclusively. Beef jerky is good, sirloin steak is better. Dried insects are fine. Fresh insects, locally prepared and spiced, are better. So unfortunately, like cricket powder doesn't win awards for being the most delicious thing, but it can, I use it as a protein powder. So I add a tablespoon to smoothies. I add it to muffins or bread. There's people making pasta with added like a protein supplement from cricket powder. Some people call it flour, but it really isn't equivalent to a flour. It's more of a higher fat, actually, protein powder that also has a little bit of fat. So nutty is the term I would use for how it tastes. Yeah, but insects broadly have very diverse flavor profiles. Grasshoppers can be kind of shrimp flavor. They kind of, I mean, they're arthropods, which is not, it's not crazy that they would taste a little seafoody. People eat these small Manchurian scorpions, not technically an insect, but a colloquial insect, and they taste like cheese. I kid you not. Mopani caterpillars, which are very popular across Southern Africa. People say they taste like barbecue chicken, but to me, they taste like trees. That's just the flavor that I get. So it's really diverse. And I will say that I like mealworms a lot. To me, they taste like soy nuts. They're just kind of like, if you dry them, they're just kind of crunchy and soy nutty. But they take the flavor of what you cook around them as well. So some insects are like centerpiece flavors and other are more subtle. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
I was thinking on the line of health food and certain insects. The medicine men have been using around for a long time.
Yes.
Might that be a good question to look at?
Yeah, the question was, should we be thinking about insects as potential medicines and health foods? There is quite a bit of research out of China on medicinal properties of insects, and there are insects used as medicine around the world. I haven't found a lot of that research published in English, so some of it may be being published in other languages. So I think that's a huge gap, and it falls under kind of the ethnobotany landscape of traditional medicines and things that sometimes are not quickly shared with outsiders because it's kind of local proprietary information for communities. So they don't always want someone to come and take and commercialize something like that. But I do think it's worth researching, absolutely. In terms of like the health food niche market, there's certainly an interest, particularly because of the allergens, like not having the same allergens as other proteins and these potential health benefits. Some people are trying to kind of market them as a health food. There's also the paleo people who are interested in insects because insect foraging was definitely part of a paleo diet. And also there was a company in Colorado that was really targeting bodybuilders. Like that was their target market, was like people who want a high protein, like bodybuilding, but they didn't want soy or they didn't want whey protein. So people have tried some of those marketing tactics with limited success, I would say. It hasn't really, in the US at least, it hasn't really caught on. But in terms of medicinals, I would love to learn more about that and know they're being used that way, particularly in China and Southeast Asia.
It sounds like the marketing that has tried to be done really doesn't have the scientific background to it. Is that true?
I think as with anything, business owners are trying to give a clear message that's easily digestible. So sometimes I think messaging is exaggerated. I wouldn't say that it's not scientifically backed at all. I mean, most people are marketing crickets as a high value protein, which is true. It's a bioavailable, complete protein that comes from an animal source, but has a lower environmental impact. That is true. So I don't think that saying that it's not scientifically backed is fair. I just think sometimes, as with anything, marketing can be murky a little bit, because nuance doesn't show up in marketing, scientific nuance, but good question. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, can any of the microbial antagonists of insects be passed on, after processing to humans?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I often get asked about risks, health risks to humans who consume insects. So fortunately, insects are taxonomically very distant from humans, and there's no evidence that eating insects, if we treat them the way we treat any animal food, poses any more risk to us than other animal foods. So cooking them to high temperatures, processing them and storing them properly. The biggest risk is contamination of the product somewhere along the line. If you're eating an insect that is already on the edible insects list and being reared for human consumption.
Kind of got me thinking, I unintentionally eat insects when I ride my bicycle.
Yeah, and you're still here. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and as I mentioned, there's parts per million insects in all processed foods. You cannot get them out because they are part of the food system. And I think that's also kind of proof that, a small amount of insect is not going to hurt anyone. There are allergens. So some people who are allergic to shellfish are also allergic to insects. So if you're deathly allergic to shellfish, do not eat crickets. I just wouldn't risk it without your EpiPen right there, just in case. And there are a few examples of wild harvested insects being contaminated with pesticides or other agricultural chemicals that made people sick. But in general, like I said, people have been eating insects throughout human history. And so I think they're as equally safe to any other animal product if processed properly.
Are there any religious dietary restrictions as far as halal and kosher, things like that?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, in Zambia, there are a lot of Seventh-day Adventists there that have some interesting perceptions of insects as food, as in, John the Baptist was said to have eaten locusts with honey in that part of the Bible. I don't remember the exact place, but so there's some religious groups that will not eat insects that crawl on the ground versus those that hop. So there are certainly religious exclusions for insect eating, and some of our colleagues more in cultural studies have been looking at that and also Hindus who may otherwise be vegetarian. Some are receptive or not receptive to eating insects, and I think it really varies across religions. I don't know anything about the halal though. That's a good question. Yes.
My stepfather owned a kosher delicatessen. I remember in the 60s, he sold chocolate covered eggs.
So I guess.
Wonderful, yeah.
Everything-
If it's blessed, it can also be kosher. That's a great point, yeah. No, that's great. Yeah. And there's a PBS Nova documentary that I was part of that aired this fall, but I think is still on there if you're a member of PBS Passport online. And I actually haven't watched it because I'm in it and I cannot watch myself. And I was also 39 weeks pregnant when I was in it. So, gained 40 pounds plus 15 pounds on television. But I do think they talk about the robotics piece in that documentary. So you might watch that about the technology around the harvesting if you're interested.
What are you feeding
What's
your
the
baby?
title?
I think it's just edible insects or something boring like that.
Do you feed your baby?
Oh yeah, my son is 19 months now, and so I've made him like muffins with crickets in them and stuff. So I'm trying to normalize for him. Also for when we travel, I want him to try all the things. And yeah, it's fun. I give them to my nephews and my nieces too, and send them Halloween like insect treats, and it's fun.
So what's the interplay with honey, which is something that's completely favorable all over the world and it's an insect food? You have that as an outlier.
Yeah, honey is so interesting because, what is honey? Kind of bee vomit. I mean, they're storing food for themselves, right? But they're like chewing and processing and then spitting it out. And like, if you think about it pretty hard, it's kind of gross. But it's obviously delicious and has so many benefits. Some cultures eat bee larvae as well. So in Zambia, they call it bana bauchi, baby of honey. And those bee larvae, when you're harvesting the honey, there'll be often like some of the comb still has larvae in it, and you'll just cook those up and eat them because they're also delicious. I mean, it's like butter, it's basically fat and honey together. So it's like very tasty. So it's funny how we can overcome disgust when something's super delicious, right? Yeah, and people are beekeeping all over the world, and yeah, it's interesting. We really do have different perceptions of different insects. Yeah.
Any meats like keyword for Oscar I mean that's century. I eat hot dogs and I can kind of look at it from the point of view like this is my environmental contribution because I don't know what's in here, but they grind it up. What do you call it? Not a slurry. Yeah, and then so, but I haven't seen anything like that about making insects into something that's like a sausage.
Yeah, there have been a few efforts in that space. IKEA, they have a restaurant inside IKEA and they do a lot of innovative food. They were working with a group that was trying to make those Swedish meatballs out of mealworms. So trying to process insects into a more meat-like product. I've been working with a man at Colorado State in the food science department who we've been making a tempeh. Have you all had tempeh that with mealworms in it as well as soy? And that was actually really good. It was very, very delicious. And there have been other groups kind of playing around with making a more meat-like patty and a meat substitute. I think texture-wise, unless you use larvae, that's tricky because like the insects are crunchier once dried, and or at least adults with the exoskeleton. So, but people have been doing that with mealworms and some other larvae. Yeah. And also pressing out the oil and using the oil for different things. Yeah.
Any others?
Thanks again.
Oh, thanks. Oh, thank you.